So, thank you for coming and joining on this discussion again, Alexander. Like I told you, we was talking for about 15 minutes. I read your book 3 times. I love it. I got tabs like crazy. It's a very interesting book. I love the cover. It's a beautiful cover. Um,
Thanks. I can show you another one because I'm a self-publisher here in Poland, but I also started publishing other books, not only mine. And here is another cover that I created. It is Kod Ptolemeusza, so it in English it's the Ptolemy Code, like the Ptolemy, the ancient historian. So I
mhm.
also made it myself, and it is a book about the ancient sources portraying the history of the Slavic people, so the local history. Because everyone was talking that I always speak about the biggest like smoking guns of history, like prehistory, pyramids, how all this our civilization and stuff like that. But I was never very focused about the local history before the medieval times because I wasn't taught it at school. We start with the first Christian king ruler of Poland, and then we go on and on when it comes to the local Polish history. So I thought it would be a great idea to publish this book, which is my friend's book about the lost history of the Slavic people, because when it comes to the modern historical view of the history of the Slavs, it is about that they came from some kinds of swamps during the 6th or 8th century, but actually, and these are archaeological facts, we've got plenty of evidence that someone was here before them. So who it were it the Slavs, and it is very interesting that plenty of ancient historians, and it is this book is like even more detailed than my book. It is sources and sources, like hundreds of sources, maybe even thousands of sources about the ancient people who are talking about either this region of Poland, of Germany, on which Slavs were living, but also about the Slavs themselves. So it is a very interesting read.
Reading this book by itself, I can just imagine what you have in that book. Do you have an English version of that coming out?
No, and probably it will be in like far future, like a year from now. And I won't be
Mhm.
publisher in English of it, so just in Polish.
So just in Polish. Okay, okay,
Yes,
okay.
and the author is a bestseller author, and he published many books about the history, mainly about the history of Slavs from different perspectives. This was the Ptolemy Code because the main idea is what Ptolemy was saying about the region of modern Poland, the regions of the
Hmm.
Slavic people. But it's, as I said, it is mostly about ancient chroniclers, historians talking about Slavs, and I just published it in Polish, and I won't be a publisher in English. I think the author would take a route similar to me, that he will self-publish it on KDP, but I can tell you when it comes to the volume, because I am the publisher, I was the editor, I made the cover of it. It is like a much denser book than mine. It is about twice or 3 times longer when it comes to the number of words and signs and symbols than mine. So it is a very in-depth read, and there are plenty of different languages in it. There is Greek, there is Latin. Maybe sometimes in my book I also mentioned some different names in different languages to compare them, but in this book it is like almost an academic, like tons of academic articles in one book. So I won't translate it into English. It is not, it would take me a long time to do so. But I can, if we are in these topics of like Poland, different books,
Hmm.
I will soon publish in Polish, and I will probably translate it, a book about Atlantis of my friend author Michael Leflam, who is a historian, Visions of Atlantis. So this will
Hmm.
be the book. Probably will publish it during May or something. Here I can show how it looks like. I've also read it like
Hold on, let
two
me
or
see.
maybe 3 times, and I will be translating it myself into Polish. So I will have all the knowledge from that in my mind deeply engraved.
Yeah, we talked about Atlantis before, but let me ask
Mm-hmm.
you. I shared this earlier. Just shared this a few seconds ago. Have you read this book right here,
No,
Ptolemy's
I
Almagest?
haven't. No.
So this book that I've read right here is where we get the idea of where you can distinguish flat Earth from the global
Mm-hmm.
Earth or round Earth that most people think about. And it was a very interesting book. To me, it was one of the hardest books I've ever read, only because for the simple fact is it's all about mathematics. I'm not good in
Mm-hmm.
mathematics, so reading this book was really, really, really hard. But I can understand the way people were thinking back then. So this, if when you was talking about Ptolemy and stuff, this came up, and this is what kind of brought my attention. Um, I want to real quick ask you, when it comes to Atlantis, who do you go to first when it comes to Atlantis? Like, who is your primary source for Atlantis?
I always research things holistically. So, of course, the main sources are the Platonic dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, but I go further and I, of course, analyze what Plato says in his dialogues and compare
Mm,
it to other sources. Like Plato is telling us that this Atlantis, this story of Atlantis, wasn't his own imagination, but it was Solon who went to Egypt and who found
mm,
information about Atlantis from the Egyptian city of Sais, from the priests who were living there. So I go into Egypt and I found out is if it is possible that really Solon journeyed to Egypt and he went and he found the information about Atlantis there. So I compared the sources and I see that yes, the city of Sais is real. It is one of the oldest cities in the Egyptian region. And another thing that we have a few historians who say that Solon was truly journeying to Egypt and they are confident that he did so. So I see, okay, this part is very, very probable, if not a fact, let's say probable. And now I want to check
mm,
out, okay, maybe it was Plato's imagination about the Atlantis story. Maybe okay,
mhm,
Solon really journeyed to Egypt, but maybe Plato added this Atlantis stuff himself. But I see that main key ideas from the Plato's Atlantis is that it was a long, long ago, about 9,000 years before Solon. So we are talking about
mhm,
long, long prehistoric times. And I see that Egyptian sources like the King's List, and there are plenty of them from different periods, like the Manetho's King's List, which is one of the most recent. Then we've got Palermo's Stone, which is one of the oldest sources, and then we've got like Turin's King's List. But there are many other sources who are similar, and these sources are telling us that according to ancient Egyptians, the Egyptian history is also older, like in the
mhm.
aforementioned Atlantis, that there was 9,000 years
Yeah.
before Solon, and the Egyptian list of kings are telling us of times up to 36, 39,000 years before the first pharaoh that we know. So I see, okay, it is probable again that Solon heard a story of some older civilization, and these dates are pretty similar when it comes to the time frames.
Mhm,
It does not go into hundreds of years back, but into thousands or even tens of thousands of years back. So
mhm,
here is a similarity. Then I take a look at other mentions, other sources, and I see that there is a mention that in the very, very past there were gods who were living on Earth, who were ruling humanity, who were the first starters of civilization, and similar echo goes when it comes to Plato's Timaeus and Critias. And then I see that there are also a few mentions that show
yeah.
that in ancient Egypt there are some version, but really scarce, of some kind of myth concerning the previous island that sank, and it was an island of gods and gods lived there, but one time there happened to be a catastrophe and they went back to Egypt. And then I see Plato, okay, destruction of Atlantis during single night and day. And then I see that Atlantis, according to Plato, had large influences over the Mediterranean, over the present land of Italy, of Greece, and of course of Egypt. So it is
Mhm,
logical to me to assume that, okay, if such a civilization existed, then I see that those people came to, let's say, Egypt and maybe started there the civilization. And it is only, I say, that I research all of that holistically because it is only the historical part. Now we go to the date 9,000 years before Solon, which is about the end of the last ice age, and whether the ice caps were melting rapidly or not. It is, of course, a discussion, but they were melting. And about 120 meters of the sea level rise, 120 meters, which is when I stand, I would see it would be like a medium-sized skyscraper. So this was the rise of the sea levels from the times of the last ice age, let's say about 13, 14,000 years ago, up until now. So I said, yeah, probably some kind of island like Atlantis or civilization could have really sunk during this time. So I see this thing because plenty of people say it is a myth. I assume that Plato didn't tell us exactly 100% truth. Of course, he added some kind of details, he added some other things. Maybe he added his own plot, his own story, his own like memory into it, but these facts that are here, these statements, we can compare them to other sources, not only historical but also geological and from other sciences, and we see that this story is very, very probable. So why are we telling that it is just a myth? We shouldn't actually take it into consideration. You are some people say like that you're idiots that you are focused on Atlantis and on some previous non-existent mythical fantastic civilizations. These are the opinions of some of true scholars, archaeologists even. So I say, wait a minute. Have you even like read and compared what is told in this story of Plato's Atlantis to other sources and to other sciences and to other facts? Because it is very easy to debunk that, okay, maybe the smelting of the ice caps was slow, so Atlantis couldn't have sunk during a single night and day. Okay, maybe not during a single night and day, but still, we have coincidentally the melting of the ice caps and huge rises in the sea level at this time when Plato is telling us, because this 9,000 years before Solon is exactly the ending of the last ice age. And maybe this additional mentions from other sources and from modern thoughts, from modern researchers, that like Graham Hancock, that people from Atlantis who survived were traveling the world and were teaching mankind the basics of civilizations. They were kickstarting again the civilization after the destruction. And of course, this is the same time during the end of the last ice age that we see the Neolithic Revolution, the start of sedentary lifestyle, and I think it is too much coincidental. And as I mentioned, I don't say that 100% of what Plato put into his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, and what he put there about Atlantis is true. I do not say that, but I say that there are some facts in these dialogues, and there are maybe some memories from other cultures, and maybe it is a memory of real events that happened long, long ago. And that's why you mentioned you've been reading my book very, very deeply, and I mentioned other like sources, other examples of myths, legends, or oral traditions that survived through very, very long periods of time to show that it is possible that some kind of memory from thousands of years ago could possibly survive those very, very millennia. So that's my take on Atlantis. We can go in depth on many other
Right.
like smaller stuff, but I think that this is the big picture that I want to show.
Right, right. I agree with you, and I say that because, you know, I try to tell people that what is actually written in the textbooks. Every person that wrote a book uses a source to write their book. When it comes to historical events, at least, right? You have certain sources that you will use. I will have certain sources that I will use, and this is a great example of the first question that I have with you. Like I said, I have a lot of tabs of you, and this fits actually the first tab that I tabbed under your book. I know you can't see it, but I'm going to read it. And you says this is exactly what you say, and I quote: according to the sources, the Sumerian gods called the Anunnaki, which is 100% true, whether you're academic or what some people will call pseudoscience. That's accurate. There were individuals called the Anunnaki out there. But then you put in parentheses, which I like, from one translation, quote, those who from heaven to earth came. End of quote. End of parentheses. And I understand why you put that, because Zachariah Sitchin is one of the first to actually put that information out there. Now, I don't know 100% sure if Sitchin was able to translate the cuneiform tablets or not, right? But what I do know is he says he was able to. Now, both me and you being authors, right, and sharing what we wrote in our books, we use sources and interpret those sources as the best of our ability, not to create a narrative, but to create curiosity, right? And to have other people who may have answers answer those questions for us. Now, Zachariah Sitchin, yes, is one of the first people who says that, those who came from Earth. And when you read his version of the book, the Anunnaki Chronicles, that came from his niece, I believe, actually gives three different versions of those who came from Earth, right? I talked about that in the past with you, which was interesting because, like I said, everything ties in together because I really read your book three times and really have done my due diligence and understand what you meant by your stuff by previous discussions with you. Now, those who came from heaven is no different to me than princely offspring, right? Because all princely offspring to me means a type of royalty, right? Which is no different than saying that the people from heaven are considered a type of royalty over the normal basic human beings, which we are considered Homo sapiens sapiens, right? So there's that right there is playing with words, right? You say princely offspring, I say those who came from heaven. Okay, because where is really heaven? Then you have to look at all the ideas and aspects and um, theories that come with heaven. When we talk about gods coming from the sky, some people will say, well, they just came from the heavens. And then some people will say, well, they just came from the mountains, right? Or they just came from higher up, right? When we look at the pyramids of Giza, it's high, it's on a higher land than the individuals on the bottom, right? Machu Picchu is like that, right? I think I said that right. And there's so many other places. Olympus, right? You have so many different places where the gods sat on top, the regular people sat on the bottom. And then we had what some people will call fallen angels or messengers, because if you look at the Strong's Concordance, where for angels, it has to do with messengers coming from heaven, walking down to the bottom, right? So to me, I don't see nothing different when somebody say princely offspring or those who came from heaven. It's just how you want to word it. You're from Poland. I'm from the United States. We're going to say things differently. It's up to both me and you to have a discussion to come up with what we both understand. Now, do you agree or disagree with me on that?
I agree because there are different because plenty of people, plenty of skeptics and scholars especially say no, Zachariah Sitchin was a liar even when
Mm-hmm.
it comes to the most extreme opinions and that his version of the word Anunnaki is wrong. But actually when it comes to the word Anunnaki, An is sky and Ki is earth, so it
Mm-hmm.
is logical that it is we can interpret it differently. Maybe it is something when it comes to connection between heaven and earth. I'm not that much into these ancient languages because it is too hard for me. I've been learning a bit of ancient Hebrew, ancient Greek, but
Mm-hmm.
only to be able to decipher the basic names and stuff. Haven't been that deep into it. Also Sanskrit, but I found that it's not necessary for me to go in this route because I can actually do much better job just analyzing the translations and just going into history. So I went away from studying these languages such deeply. And yes, but I think that this even princely offspring, and you mentioned somewhere from the higher up, I think it is not a mention of physical world that they came from mountains, but I think it is what you called when it comes to angels, that they are messengers between the earth and heaven, between some kind of metaphysical realm and here the earth realm, between the spirituality and the material stuff. And I think the same is when it comes to those rulers, either from ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, ancient India, or any other stuff. We have plenty of metaphysical beliefs of those ancient people, which are little bit similar, that some kinds of gods or entities that were more, let's say, spiritual than us were those kinds of beings that were higher up, and those kinds of beings started ruling the first humans, kickstarted the civilization. In the Plutarch, Isis and Osiris, there's a mention that the god Osiris, when he came to the region of Egypt, he found very primitive people, like we can say maybe hominids, maybe Homo sapiens, sapiens, but hunter-gatherers, and there is a mention that he was, what is happening? And he started teaching them, because they were even cannibals. They were eating each other alive. And he mentions that you can do that. He mentioned how to have families, how to live in a society. He started the civilization, and then there's a very important mention that he went and he journeyed the entire earth and taught other humans. And when it comes to that, my actually opinion on ancient aliens, Anunnaki, and stuff like that is that these beings were some kind of non-physical entities, like ghosts, like souls, like spirits. And I think the best evidence for ancient aliens isn't found in these Anunnaki stories, isn't in any megaliths or other, let's say, alien depictions that we see on programs like Ancient Aliens, but these are the direct experiences of both our ancient ancestors and of modern humans, who very often, when it comes
Hmm.
to psychedelic states or hypnotic states, experience very, very similar thing, no matter of their tradition, location, their beliefs on God, spirituality. And it applies both to psychedelic substances, it applies both to ancient, because many ancient rituals were concerned with either out of body experiences, near death experiences, or just hypnagogic states, as we can call them. And I think this is the best evidence, because it's like scientific evidence. We see that most of the people, maybe not all, maybe not 100%, but a majority of people who experience such states very often tell us of the same things. And we can, of course, interpret it. Maybe these are just hallucinations and inventions of our minds, but maybe these are not, and maybe these are true spiritual, non physical experiences. And we see that they are very similar the world over.
And that's interesting. And I say that because nobody really knows who the Anunnaki and where they came from, right? Um, but I've read in the Handbook, and I talked about this before, was that it says that they came from the seas, right? Now, I do understand that the seas is on Earth. I know what the sea is on Earth, right? But I've also heard that, the universe, the space is also known as a sea because
Mm-hmm.
there's water out there, right? There's water in space. I'm 40, like I told you before, I'm 41 years old. And I know when I was in school, there were a lot of the teachers when I was growing up, and it could be different from different people because of, the education of the people around you. But the teachers that I had would say that NASA is looking for water in space. Well, there has always been water in space. Water is all around us. It's just in different forms, right? So I understand that the universe or the
I
go ahead,
can
go ahead.
comment on that because yes, you are right, and it's not about that they knew that there is water in space. Maybe they knew, but it is about their ancient beliefs that they thought when it comes to the cosmology and even astronomy, that the cosmos, what we see between the stars, this dark thing, is actually some kind of infinite waters. We see it in ancient Egypt when the creation comes from the infinite waters, from infinite chaos potential, like in the Greek version that at the beginning was chaos, and from this chaos we can compare to the cosmos. There forms material stuff like gods, and of course these gods were later ascribed to certain planets. That the Mars is of course Mars or Ares, and this was the cosmological thing. So often these ocean stuff, because the same as primitive peoples, when they saw the ocean, they compared it to, because they saw it almost infinitely, because they were located at one point and they've seen like infinite ocean. And in ancient Egyptian thought especially, there is a mention of infinite waters from which the first creation comes. There are these islands, there are these gods, etc. So yes, it is right, but we can distinguish the ocean, like this infinite idea of infinity, of what is out there, to like the local stuff, because you mentioned that Anunnaki came from some kind of ocean, sea, but for instance also in the Mesopotamian thought, the Apkallu, the seven sages, also came from waters, because there is even this leader of Apkallu, Oannes, who is this fish like person in the fish costume, and we know that he came from water. So I think that maybe there was a distinction between like normal waters that they knew and this idea of infinite waters, of infinite cosmos, of infinite potential, and what could be out there. So it would also be connected to the idea that these Anunnaki were from somewhere else. And also we see this in cosmologies, because I mentioned Egypt. There are different versions of this story, but in one version there is the Atum as the first like god, and ancient Egyptians couldn't depict him, because we know that Osiris or other gods have like bodies of humans and often heads of some animals. But actually Atum, according to ancient Egyptian, was indescribable. So you cannot show the Atum. I will in a moment check this out. So they mentioned that Atum is the primary god, the source, as we can say in the modern New Age spiritual language. And they mentioned that from him, from his thought, and then from his word, in this realm of infinite waters, of infinite chaos, of infinite potential, they then came to be the first gods, and they procreated, and there was this
Hmm.
hierarchy of gods. And I think this is similar to the mention that those Anunnaki came from those waters, from those either ocean or some different water source, that it is a similar kind of cosmology, and we see echoes of that cosmology, maybe not the exact ones, in, for instance, Phoenician thought, in the Hindu thought, when we have like infinite something, and we have the Brahman, the ultimate consciousness, and we have the famous Om, the first sound that is sound of creation, and that there it starts creating, and that it is a constant battle between chaos and things that exist. Okay, I will check this out.
Yeah, this is I think I showed you this before, where it talks about the Calhu, which you was talking about, or the Apkalu
Mm-hmm.
and stuff. This is where, let me show you real quick
Yeah, I see. It
while
is,
you
I think, similar to what I mentioned in the book, that this Apkal were like the teachers of
yeah.
mankind, and even this mention is very important, that they were like big fish, because
Mhm.
I think of the same period of time, or even older source from ancient India. I don't remember what it was. I have it in my book, but the source which tells us the flood of Manu, it is very, very old, more than 2000 years before current era. And in this
Mhm.
version, of course, the main hero isn't Atrahasis or Yushudra, but it is Manu, Hindu Manu. And also there is a
Mhm.
mention that he's warned about the flood by the god Vishnu, who appears as a
Mhm.
big fish, which can be another connection to that. And in the Mesopotamian stories, we've got the seven sages, the seven Apkallu, and in the Hindu one, we've got this big fish, and we've got that the main hero, this Manu, takes onto his boat those seven sages. So we have the main hero who takes seven people, both in Mesopotamian version, both in Hindu version, but also in the Bible, because there is Noah, there is Noah's wife, three of his sons, and three wives of the sons. So we have six people plus Noah's wife, so Noah plus
Mhm.
seven people, which is the same, which shows us that these are not just mere inventions, but there was some kind of inspiration between those memories of the flood.
Right, 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 right. And that's interesting that you bring all that up because this is the next point that I put up. And it's on page 57, chapter 2. And it actually says, I'm going to read it. Yeah, I want you to
Mm-hmm.
pull it out. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, read. I will check out too.
This is interesting. It says even without being aware of it, by using such associations, our mind subconsciously takes the word myth for something untrue and suspicious, which only makes it more and more difficult for us to rationally approach this kind of story. Now, I found that
Mm-hmm.
interesting because that's a very true statement. Now, have you ever looked up the etymology word for or the definition of myth? Like, I'm pretty sure you have.
Probably long ago, but.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I looked up the etymology of the word myth. Hold on, let me bring it back up because it just backed out on me for some reason. So it says it comes from, the 1830s. Let me bring it up too, just so we
Mm-hmm.
can follow along
Yes, I
together.
will
This
check it
is
out.
interesting. This is interesting. So this is what it says about um, myth, right? Hold on, let me bring this over here on this other screen so I can have. Here we go. So you see where it says 1830, right? It says 1830 from French myth and directed from modern Latin mythos, right? Now, really, all it is speech, thought, word, discourse, conversation, story,
Mm-hmm.
tale. And then it has highlight myth, anything delivered. And then it goes into the last thing that it says. Hold on, let me make it bigger. It
Mm-hmm.
says
Yes, I see.
anything delivered by word of mouth, a word of unknown origin. Now that doesn't necessarily say that,
Mm-hmm. I agree.
it's fake, right? It's just telling you that in reality, it's anything that's spoken by mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And we as individuals, me, you, and everybody else who listen to these words, have to take our due diligence and our time and figure out what is the truth versus the facts, right? Or the fiction, right? You have to find the truth over the fiction, and the only way you can do that is by doing your due diligence, right? You have to go in there and see it for yourself. So yeah, I
Yes,
just wanted to
so
make.
I actually, thanks for bringing it on because I actually agree with this definition that most myths are just like some old memories who were preserved and who were orally delivered through the ages, through the generations, and stuff like that. But nowadays, when we think of myths, like in culture, we see mythbusters busting the myths that myths are fake. We actually, in the modern times, see the myth as some kind of superstition. Even we synonymously say myth and superstition, which is nothing like the myth, because here in this definition, the myth is not superstition. It is just an oral tradition that was preserved to, let's say, generalize it. So I agree with this definition. And that's why
It's
said, because there are plenty of like modern, I would say, ideologies who are we are bombarded with this information, with this not superstition, but with all of those false meanings, and we think with these ideas they dominate our thought that myth equals superstition, this equals that. So
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because you said traditional oral story, right? That's literally what I found from being a myth. When I typed in myth and I go to Oxford Languages, it
mm-hmm,
says a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history
mm-hmm,
of a people, or explaining some natural or social phenomena, and typically involving supernatural beings or events.
mm-hmm,
Typically doesn't mean that it always
yes,
does, but typically, right? That's because that's the way people, you know, telling a
mm-hmm,
story, telling an entertaining type of story helps people remember it. When you go, I don't know how many times other people went to church, but when I go to a church and it's very boring, I'm not going to pay attention to the message, right? The message is not
mm-hmm.
going to come through, right? That's why everything is important when it comes to entertaining. So that's why I thought that was pretty interesting that you
Yes,
said
I
that.
can even elaborate on that. First, the thing that you mentioned about the memory, and I mention it a lot in my book that the first stories were preserved orally, and just as nowadays we have, for instance, schools that teach children to recite the entire Quran, in the past there were similar let's say, schools that were teaching people, especially in India, to recite the Vedas exactly, and we know of their existence. And there is even an allegory of Plato who is telling us that, and it is again allegory, but at the same time filled with facts, because he mentions that at some point when the Egyptian god of wisdom Thoth introduced the first letters, the first script into ancient Egyptian cultures, people started losing memory because they were writing everything down and they didn't need to memorize everything. So it is allegory filled with facts, because we know that ancient Egyptians thought that the god Thoth introduced the script, the letters into ancient Egyptian culture. And at the same time, there is this allegory that because of the introduction of this script, people started losing memory, which is also showing us that before that people were living differently. People were mostly concerned about the oral traditions and they didn't care about writing things down, because everything was going like later in many mystery schools from teacher to the student, and throughout the generations that was how the tradition was passed down through generations. So it is another very interesting thing. But also I wanted to share another thing when it comes to myth, and it is a little bit like my own conspiracy theory throughout the ages, and how the science started dominating our thought. Because science started with debunking the myths, because science was of course invested into the empirical knowledge, that what we can measure, that what we can demonstrate, what we can repeat, and everything about the material world. So science was going on and it started debunking the myths, because people believed that some kinds of thunderstorms are caused by gods, like Zeus is using these lightning bolts of humanity, but also many there were plenty of other, let's say, myths, because these were myths, beliefs and superstitions about the natural world, that these things in natural worlds like thunderstorms, like growing of plants, many people all around the world thought that these were caused by supernatural beings like gods or supernatural forces. And science started with saying, no, 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 those natural things like the growth of plants, like procreation, like storms, like climate, etc., all those things have natural sources, natural phenomena at its core, and they were showing people. So they started with debunking the myths, and they were debunking tons of it, and then science was gaining confidence and gained this confidence that, and nowadays it is a core assumption when it comes to science, that all natural phenomena have natural sources. So everything that we see in the natural material world is caused by natural phenomena. So to sum up, there is nothing supernatural. And it is my little bit conspiracy theory that science gained so much confidence after debunking those primitive superstitions that it started generalizing that, okay, we debunked 99% of what they were believing, those primitive people, about some gods causing thunders, etc. So now everything in the natural world is caused by natural phenomena. There is nothing supernatural, and it was actually start of materialism, that only matter and its interactions exist, and also start of atheism, that if we debunked so many things that people thought were caused by supernatural, maybe there does not exist anything supernatural. And I think it's bad, because it, again, as this example with the myths shaping our reality, that we think that when we think myths, oh, it's fake, it's some kind of superstition. And the same with science, that science starts to having a monopoly on knowledge, on the idea of knowing everything that is outside of us, and it starts to shape us that, okay, we see that science can naturally, in the terms of natural physical material realm, explain everything, so maybe there is no soul, there is no god, there is no supernatural. And I think it is very, very bad, and there may be even a bigger conspiracy theory, like for example Satanism. And Satan is, of course, in different versions, it is also very, very complicated, but Satan is often called the king of the material realm. So it may be also connected to that. So it is again, explanation of how science arrived and how it works, that it is based on, it is called naturalism, which is similar to materialism, because materialism means that there only exist matter and its interactions, and some people say it's an assumption of science, but to be more general, one of the main assumptions of science, and these assumptions say that, okay, if you do anything in the realm of supernatural, you're a pseudoscientist, you're some kind of fool, hoaxer, liar, charlatan, etc. And this naturalism means exactly what I said, that natural things in the natural world have causes in the natural realm, so there are no supernatural causes, which is, in my opinion, very harmful for people, because it leads to not having any purpose in life, just being primitive biological machines. There is nothing more than this material realm, and we start behaving like animals, and we degrade as humanity as a whole. And we see that the biggest things, the biggest changes in the world, in culture, were often led by spirituality of any kind, either religion or some personal spiritual beliefs, but they were often inspired, even inspiration has some roots often in our lives or in the lives of the greatest persons in something non-material, non-rational, irrational. So I think it is very harmful that science is actually having putting for us these glasses of only seeing the material natural world.
Right. When you said that, that was pretty interesting because when you said science has a monopoly on things, that's pretty interesting because, science either proves things or disproves things. And that's up to whether, what scientific evidence comes about. Now, this is what's interesting to me. You can have two scientists going to school at the same school, taking the same class with the same teacher, learning the same material, but have several different ideas and theories about what they've learned. And I know that we don't really actually have an example of that. But what we do have an example of is people going to different schools, having the same credentials, same amount of years, but have two different theories about, you know, these supernatural or natural things.
Maybe I will
One thing,
explain the science as a whole in a moment.
okay, yeah, because what I was about to get into was physics. A lot of people say physics only applies to here on Earth. Physics doesn't apply to Mars or
It
Jupiter or
applies,
so
it
on.
applies.
You say it applies, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Physics applies, and I can clarify for
yeah,
everyone, because I see that there are plenty of misconceptions about science, and some
yeah.
people say that science is led by dogmas, and other people say that science is telling us the truth, and if anything is outside of science is, as we mentioned, pseudoscience, so hoax, some charlatans, etc. But it comes from not understanding what science is, because science isn't about the truth about our reality, but it's about the truth about natural world. We even say that sciences like physics, chemistry, biology are natural sciences, because as I mentioned, science is not about discovering the ultimate truth, but it has some primary assumptions. I think before
Okay,
in
yeah, yeah,
our
yeah. I like it.
conversation before I mentioned those, but these are the assumptions. So if one of those assumptions, I won't go into other because I mentioned it in our previous conversations, but if one of the assumptions is, as I mentioned, naturalism, that nothing supernatural happens, therefore, when it comes to the entire existence or non-existence, science has only a domain. Its application is in the domain of the physical natural realm. So what is science? Science is knowledge about the natural material, whatever you can say, world. So about small bubble, let's say, in the infinite potential, if we take into, let's say, account a possibility of something spiritual, non-physical, other worlds, heavens and hells or something. So science is only applicable to the natural material world, and that's what I meant when it comes to monopoly on knowledge, because science nowadays, because of this it was very, very popular. Disinformation. You're a charlatan. You're a pseudoscientist. It's not science. It's looking like for lay people that science wants the truth and everyone outside of science isn't for the truth. But actually, it often is the case that people who want to discover spiritual, non-physical stuff, who are interested in this kind of manners or philosophy, is often ridiculed that philosophy is not science. There are, of course, different opinions about that, but science applies only to the material world. And what is science? Science is the pursuit of the knowledge of the natural or material world. So everything beyond the matter, beyond, let's say, time, space, beyond the natural world, is not within the scope of science. Just like biology has its scope within the living organism, but outside of the scope of biology are non-organic, not living stuff, like rocks are not when it comes to biology. So the same within the entire science. Science only applies and has its domain when it comes to the natural material world and not outside. So saying that someone who's interested in spirituality, non-physical, like out-of-body experience or something like that, that he is pseudoscientist, yes, he's not scientist because science does not apply to the realm of his investigations. And if that's why I'm not also a scientist in the strict case, because if I want to discover the truth about anything, the world outside of me, I will never limit myself only to the idea that there is only matter and its interaction, or there is nothing supernatural. So that's why I took another route, and that's how it all works.
That's interesting you say that. And I say that because I like to look up the etymology of words. That's just how I get the better understanding of what people are and what they're saying. I don't try to make up my own definitions and stuff like that because it's hard. So, like you said, I looked up the etymology for science. And one of the words that struck out for me was knowledge, state or fact, state or fact of knowing what is known, knowledge of something acquired by study, information, also assurance of knowledge. So basically anything that has to do with knowledge, right?
Yes, but it is very, very seen in Polish language because we still use this old etymology of science. Because, as I said, nowadays science isn't this science anymore. Because in the past, anyone was scientist.
Mm-hmm.
Alchemists were scientists too. Philosophers were also called scientists. But nowadays,
Mm-hmm.
the word science is very, very strict. And as I mentioned, there is no singular definition of science, but we can, for instance, define science by its main assumptions. For instance, this old science is about any human knowledge, so knowledge of metaphysical, of God, would also apply to this definition that you've just shown us. But nowadays it only applies to this naturalism, so all the
Yep.
natural stuff, but also to rationalism. So anything irrational or not comprehended by the human mind, which is also similar to your definition, wouldn't be science. So anything like spiritual experiences are often not people are not able to describe them in physical or worldly terms. So this would apply, and nowadays in Poland we still use nauka, so science, as it is the same, but we still use this old one that any kind of knowledge is to some extent science. If you are, learning it, if you're applying it, it is still science. But nowadays it changes its definition.
Yeah, and you're right. And the reason why I say that is because you can look
Yes,
at the
lucky.
highlight. It says the original notion in the Latin verb probably is to separate one thing from another, to distinguish, right? And then it goes on, but then we come right here. Oh, I got to make sure I'm on the right screen. So that's at the original notion. It says right
Yes, I
here
see.
where it says OED writes that the oldest English sense of the word now is restricted to theology and philosophy. So
Yes, it's exactly it's similar at least to what I said.
exactly. So when that's my
Yes, and
point
then
is
there
that
is that from 1400s experimental knowledge. So this is the shift that we started shifting from knowledge and science about anything to being specialized in the material, experimental world that we see, natural. Yeah.
yeah, and that's why I bring that up because it's just to me
Thank
it's
you.
just
Great.
It's just
That's great.
important because most people who know me know that I like to talk about etymology. I like to talk about definitions. I mean, I have dictionaries right here. I have little. I showed you this last time. I have these right
Mm-hmm.
here, a dictionary, a thesaurus, and a vocabulary builder because I'm trying to build my vocabulary. And there's many ways you can do that. There's so many different ways. But I looked that up because I try to make sure that I understand what the person is saying, so that way, um, instead of arguing about the small things, I can say, well, I can agree with you because I can see where you get your information from, right? And it has changed from uh, the hundreds of years and probably thousands of years of our writing systems. We our writing system has changed so many times to the point where, like I said, you're Polish and I'm from America. We're going to say different things differently. I have a certain type of lingo in slang that I would say things in, and there would be things that you would say, and I'll be like, "What is that?" But when we understand it and put it together, it's like, "Oh yeah, when you say that, that's how I hear things," right? So that's interesting. Oh, so going to another tab that you talked about. All this goes back to myths, right? And when you talked about myths, we talked about science. Now, both myth and science has said that there has been some type of planet. This is what you said in chapter 4. I'm just going to read from chapter
Mm-hmm.
4, page 115. You said, additionally, about 11,500 years ago, there was most likely a complete reversal of our planet's polarity, meaning a swap of the poles. Now, both myth and science have said that so many times. I mean, you can just, if you know about tectonic plates, you can tell that, the poles have changed, right? What has probably been in the South Pole is eventually going to make it to the North Pole, and so on and so forth, just by the way the Earth moves and whatnot. But why was that important for you to put that in the book? And I just want to make sure that I understood why you put it in there, because to me, before you even say it, I felt like that you was talking about the change in how so much of our climate has changed us in particular, from migrations to the size that we are, to the myths that we inherited from that time frame till now.
As I mentioned at the beginning, I wanted to go into this topic holistically. That's why I do not only write about history, sources, archaeology, but I also, from the first chapter, start with some kind of geology, astrophysics, some kind of a catastrophes. And the same here, I wanted to know why this shift was happening, why there was the end of the last ice age, and could it be that there was some primary cause of it? Because we can say that okay, there were those climate changes all the time throughout millions or even billions of years, but I wanted to know if such a sudden change, because we have all these myths about the destruction of Atlantis, about the Great Flood, about other civilizations and cultures, and about there are plenty of catastrophic myths from all around the world, so I wanted to find out, is it possible that this end of the last ice age, during which, as I was mentioning before, there were melting of the glaciers, could it be that it was caused by some kind of comet strike, some kind of a catastrophe, or maybe, as in this example you mentioned, the reversal of the poles, because we know that the poles, magnetic poles, are changing all the time. And I mentioned in this quote that you've mentioned that it was probably because there are plenty of different theories. There is the younger dryas impact hypothesis. There are different theories about the either pole reversals. There are many theories about poles. Either they were reversed, either they changed their position a bit, or maybe there was demagnetization, so the poles changed their magnetic, like north to south, south to north. There are different theories. That's why I said probably, because we still do not know. There is the main dogma that there was probably no catastrophe at the end of the last ice age, but we know from history that dogmas change, and there are paradigm shifts, and that our knowledge is changing. And I'm, as I mentioned, the man that if I want to know the truth, I know to know what is up there beyond me or within me. So I do not limit myself either to only science, either to only myths, either to only one paradigm, either to only one view when it comes to the world, when it comes to the philosophical view, and I search all the directions. And as you mentioned at the beginning, I still am of the opinion that we as humanity, and of course me myself too, we do not know the truth. We are still coming into it. That's why here is probably it happened, but maybe not. Maybe there was a different thing. I wanted to search, and I searched tons of different sources, and I mentioned those that seem very likely, very probable, because we see that there were catastrophes during even our human timeline. There were different volcanoes erupting, there were different like extraterrestrial bodies that hit our Earth. So why not? The same scenario was happening during that prehistoric times of the end of the last ice age. So this is what I meant with that.
Right on, right on. Let me. That's interesting because I love having your book right here. I know this is you right here, man. This is this book right here is gonna last for thousands and thousands of years. You know that people are going to look at your book and they're going to say, "Hey, so just knowing that you have this book, you gonna be known." So you actually say all that on chapter 4, on page 119, and you actually get into American Great Lakes. So that'd be interesting for people who live in that area to pick up your book and read about it, because you take in your knowledge from all those places around there. And then you go into Gobekli Tepe, Mesoamerica on page 128, and you go into the handbags. Now, let me ask you, this is interesting because this happened. I see this question everywhere. What were the Anunnaki holding in those bags? What were they carrying? What was this, that, and the third? And I've done my diligence and I've read a couple of books on it. I actually will bring it up when you're talking. But there's an individual who wrote about it, and I learned that these bags had like seeds or medicine or some type of herbs or something like that, and they brought it from one place to another. And that some people would take the whole science thing, where if we was traveling to space, we what was the briefcase that they're handing, and they showed like the similarities between the briefcase and the
Yes,
bag and
yes.
stuff. So but what let me ask you, what is your idea
I
about
still
this
don't know
bag?
what was exactly this bag, but I think it's one of the most primitive thing when it comes to the first civilizations, that they were having something, some kind of bags or buckets to carry stuff on. So I think at one point it is natural that they had those buckets, but now we see Gobekli Tepe 12,000 or even more years ago, 12,000 or more years ago, and here we see like from 8,000 years BC, 2,000 years BC, another Mesopotamian inscriptions with those bags. We see Mesoamerican even later encryptions with these bags. So I see that they are too similar to each other to be like independent of each other. And I think it's my take on it, because I understand that everyone was having some kind of buckets or some kind of handbags to carry things on. It's a natural thing, but they are too similar from the world over, but not only from different parts of the world, but also from different eras in time. And we say about Göbekli Tepe 12,000 years ago, deep prehistory, and here we've got Mesopotamia, almost the same inscription. It isn't about only it being a bag, because we see this almost the same dimension, the same holding of it. It is very, very similar. And as you mentioned, some people say these were the seeds or something else, and it all depends, because there are different versions from different eras who are telling us different things about the bags. But what I was wanting, what was my intention when it comes to bags, that these are the similarities. And if we take similarities between these bags all over the world throughout the millennia, we see megaliths which are similar all over the world throughout millennia, or the similarities between the pyramids not only being like some kind of artificial hills, but also taking into account their very details, we see that there was something going on during our deep past, and that those inscriptions aren't just random, but I still don't know what they were holding in there. Maybe it was a symbolic thing, maybe it was a symbol of knowledge because these bags were often with Apkalus or with other sages, teachers of mankind, but I don't know.
So yeah, I read a lot of different books, of course, and I got a Kindle too because a lot of these books are free online, right? And you don't
Mm-hmm.
have to spend so much money buying it. I bought this book from I got this book from Maximilian de Lafayette, and it's an explanation of Sumerian and Assyrian tablets, slabs, and seals, and translations of the cuneiform inscriptions, and it's volume one of from the series. And we seen these bags all the time, right? These bags every time. And we see the little pine cone, and then we know what this is, right? So, it says a Babylonian guardian holding in his hand what would be called a
Once
lag.
again, something with your microphone happened.
Oh, it did? It
Yes,
went
now
out?
it's nice. Now it's nice. I don't know what it is, but
Is it better?
now I can hear you well. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so going back to what this is, we always see the pine cones and the bag right here,
Mm-hmm.
and so on and so forth, and then we see it. So is in his book in the description, it's a Babylonian guardian holding in his hand Lagi Zulum, right? And it's a date palm basically. And then what I've learned is that when you go to the next one, it actually talks about how it's for fertile agriculture, lands and
Mm-hmm.
civilization, prosperity, cure for many diseases and illnesses. And then it tells you what the Zulu means, which is date, and then
Mm-hmm.
Gish Imar means date palm, and it gives you the symbolism and the eagle, and it tells you the eagle-headed deity. But this is from 883 59
Mm-hmm.
BC, right? But we know that um, when they're putting together the Mesopotamian tablets and cuneiform tablets from that time frame, they're not using all of Sumerian. They're using Sumerian,
Mm-hmm.
Akkadian, Assyrian, and Hittites because what the Sumerians had deteriorated in their tablets, the Akkadians had in theirs, and then so on with the Assyrians and the Hittites and so on and so forth. But it's just interesting for me to know that, um, for one, there is an actual idea description of what these bags are, right? And
Mm-hmm.
um, it's like I said from Maximilian de Lafayette. Now I don't know if you ever seen any of his stuff or read his books. He
Probably
has it
not.
on. Yeah, if you have a
But
Kindle, go
looks
to
and
his book.
sounds very interesting.
Yeah, it really does, and I'll tell you the reason why. Um, I don't know how exactly I came with his books, but I had bought my Kindle, and I was like, oh man, he has a lot of books about the Sumerians, and I came across this one where it says the explanation of Sumerian Assyrian tablets. So what I did was I said to myself, what I need to do is I need to read these books because maybe he has something about the the bags in there, and that's how I found his bags. Now, I'm gonna do something real quick. I'm gonna see if I can find his stuff on Amazon because he has a lot of stuff. If you look at his what he did, man, this guy has a lot of information out there, and he's wrote like a lot of books. Like I want to say before I even type it in, like probably like 60 something odd books. I'm not sure, but man, look here. I'm about to screen share with you so you can see. Let me move this Amazon to this side. But
Mm-hmm.
you see he has a lot of books right here, and his information is pretty interesting. Like, and most of it is on Kindle. It's like this. All this guy did was just write books. Like I read this one right here. I've read this one. Uh,
Pretty interesting.
yeah, this dude, this one right here,
Need to
the
read some.
Anunnaki chronology. Yeah, like he has a lot of books. I mean, this dude has been writing books. I mean, you can see right here. Like
Mm-hmm.
he has a lot of knowledge, bro. And this is one of the books. I think this is the one we just went over. Yeah, this is the one we just went over. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
interesting author.
Need
So
to check them out.
yeah, I don't know exactly how I came up and found him. I wish I could give credit to the person that gave me, if there was a person, or if I just seen it on Kindle to get it. Because I'm telling you, having a Kindle, bro, I take my notes on this thing, bro. It says Kindle Scribe. Right now, I'm reading this right here, the Hebrews Feast
Mm.
Explored. But you can take notes. It's a really good book. It's a really good thing. But a lot of what you said has been said plenty of times over, right? And it's just interesting that we've gotten to the point where people make absolutes, and I see the many books that you have behind you. I guarantee you can right now turn around and pick two books from your shelf that contradict each other, right? You could probably
Yes, yes.
yeah, yeah. See, so it's just it's interesting.